CGSR. We have a very interesting speaker this afternoon. Matt Kroenig. He's Associate Professor and International Relations Field Chair in the Department of Government at Georgetown University in Washington, and a non-resident Senior Fellow at the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security at the Atlantic Council. He is an expert on defense policy and strategy, international relations theory, nuclear deterrence, nuclear proliferation, Iran, and counterterrorism. The author of several books, including The Iranian Nuclear Threat, Choices and Consequences, which will be published next year, I believe, and Exporting the Bomb, Technology Transfer and the Spread of Nuclear Weapons. That was in 2010, which received the International Studies Association's Best Book Award, honorable mention. His articles have appeared in such publications as American Political Science Review, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, International Organization, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Post, and USA Today. He regularly provides commentary on BBC, CNN, C-SPAN, NPR, and other outlets. And he previously served in the Office of the Secretary of Defense and the Central Intelligence Agency. He regularly consults with defense, energy, and the intelligence communities. I'm not used to quantitative political science, so I've been getting an education since I met Matt. And I think you're going to hear a bit about quantitative political science and perhaps game theory today. Anyway, thank you, Matt. Why don't you, I'll sit down and you can educate us.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Bruce. It's really a pleasure to be here at Livermore. I felt like a kid on Christmas Eve a couple days ago, not because it's the holiday season, but because I knew that I was going to get a vault tour from Bruce. And as a nuclear weapons expert who's never actually seen a nuclear weapon or even a mock-up of a nuclear weapon, that was quite a thrill for me. So it was great to do that, and it's always, of course, great to escape Washington in December and get out to California. So pleasure to be here. As Bruce mentioned, I'm going to talk about some research I've been doing over the past few years on nuclear posture and its relationship to nuclear deterrence, nuclear strategy, nuclear coercion. So the question I want to ask in today's talk is, what determines the outcome of crises between nuclear armed states? So before 1945, great powers used to fight wars with each other. Since 1945, they've been deterred from doing so by nuclear weapons. But after 1945, international politics didn't end. Nuclear armed states still got into disputes, still wanted to threaten each other to achieve their goals, but they had a problem. They couldn't threaten to fight a suicidal nuclear war. So how do nuclear armed states then determine these political conflicts of interest? Well, one way they do this is by engaging in nuclear crises, these high-stakes games of nuclear chicken, where they stare each other down, raising the risk of nuclear war, and stare each other down until one side blinks and the other side gets its way. So think about the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Berlin Crisis, recent crises between India and Pakistan, such as the Kargil Crisis, Sino-Soviet border war, Suez Crisis. In fact, in my research, I've identified 20 separate nuclear crises since 1945. Understanding then the outcomes of these crises becomes very important. It's an important determinant of the international distribution of power and influence. As Stanley Hoffman, famous late professor at Harvard University, wrote, the post-1945 international system can really be understood as, quote, the substitution of crises for wars. The substitution of crises for wars. So what determines the outcome of these crises? Well, in my talk today, I'm going to argue that nuclear superiority matters, that countries with a larger, more sophisticated arsenal than their opponents are more likely to achieve their basic political goals in these games of nuclear chicken. So next slide, please. So what I'm going to do over the next 30 minutes or so is four things. First, I'm going to talk about the debate. What have people said about this issue before, and about whether nuclear superiority matters or not? Second, I'm going to present my argument as to why I think nuclear superiority matters. Third, I'm going to present some systematic empirical evidence from 1945 to 2002. And then finally, I'll conclude with the implications for U.S. defense policy. Next slide. So first, the debate. And actually, next slide also. So historically, there have been two answers to this question of what determines the outcome of nuclear crises. On one hand, you have people who argue that it's the balance of resolve that matters, that in these games of nuclear chicken, it's the side that's willing to run the greatest risk of nuclear war, this side that's willing to escalate the crisis furthest before backing down, who will eventually get its way. And the balance of resolve is essentially determined by political stakes, that one side will care more about the crisis, if it's fighting over its national existence or an important foreign policy objective. So they'll be willing to run a high risk of nuclear war. The other side will care less, and so that side that cares less will back down earlier. So people who have argued this include Robert Jervis, who's a famous professor at Columbia University, Charles Glazer, who's now at George Washington University in DC, Robert Powell, who's a professor at UC Berkeley, down the highway, has also argued this. On the other hand, you have people who argue that nuclear superiority matters, that countries with larger, more sophisticated arsenals are more likely to get their way in a crisis, that because they bring more firepower to bear, the other side is going to be deterred and intimidated and is more likely to back down. So Paul Nitze, a famous defense official in many U.S. administrations, argued this point. Colin Gray, a professor in the UK, has also argued this. Next slide, please. There are a couple of problems, I think, with the debate and our understanding of this knowledge, or understanding of this question up to this point, however. First, we have no real systematic evidence to bring to bear on these questions. So the existing studies, well, first of all, a lot of the writing is largely theoretical, or indeed even theological. People come with kind of preconceived notions about whether numbers of nuclear weapons matter or not, and that's what drives their conclusion. So they don't even attempt to bring evidence to bear, just kind of make theoretical arguments. There have been some empirical studies, but there are some problems with the existing empirical studies. So first, most of them are largely qualitative, looking at high-profile cases and trying to draw sweeping conclusions from one or two cases. Most of these focus on the Cuban Missile Crisis. What does the Cuban Missile Crisis tell us? Was the Cuban Missile Crisis about resolve? Was it about American nuclear superiority? Was it about something else? And then there are some quantitative studies, large and statistical studies. But the problem with this research so far is that it's treated nuclear weapons possession essentially as a dichotomous variable. It looked at whether countries involved had nuclear weapons or not, but didn't look at the nuclear balance of power, which is what policymakers have always argued is what matters, not just whether you possess nuclear weapons or not, but what does your arsenal look like, what does your adversary's arsenal look like, and what does the balance look like. I think another limitation is that people arguing the superiority side did a poor job of articulating an argument as to why superiority mattered. Because on the other hand, you have people who argue that once you have a secure second strike capability, once you have the ability to absorb an enemy nuclear attack and respond with a devastating counterattack, that's all that matters. And at that point, once you're above and beyond a secure second strike capability, additional nuclear weapons don't really matter. And the people arguing the superiority side didn't really have a good response to that. So just now quote a couple of the critics of earlier arguments in favor of superiority. Mark Trachtenberg, who's a professor at UCLA, historian and political scientist, wrote, quote, "Those who emphasize the strategic balance tend to assume that its effects are virtually automatic. The Soviets were outgunned in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and they had no choice but to accept the terms the United States insisted on," end quote. So you don't have the context there, but he's basically saying that they don't do a good job of laying out the argument. They assume that the effects are somehow automatic. Again, the Soviets are outgunned. They have no choice but to back down. Similarly, Charles Glazer argues, quote, "The logical case for the argument that a nuclear advantage provides states with bargaining leverage is weak. Proponents have done little to support their claims, and efforts to fill in the logical gaps in their arguments encounter overwhelming difficulties," end quote. So what I try to do in this research is fill in those logical gaps and turn to more systematic empirical evidence. So try to improve on what I saw as the previous state of the research. So next slide, please. So the next thing I want to do then is spell out a theoretical, kind of logical argument as to why we should think that the nuclear balance of power would matter in these high-stakes crises. So next slide, please. So first I begin with nuclear brinkmanship theory. It's kind of the basic theory of how states compete, how nuclear-armed states compete in a world of mutually assured destruction. This was first articulated by Thomas Schelling a famous nuclear strategist, actually won the Nobel Prize in economics for his work on nuclear deterrence theory. And so Schelling pointed out that there's a credibility problem with nuclear deterrence. Again, nuclear armed states still have conflicts of interest. They want to threaten each other to get their way in international crises. But how do you threaten to start a nuclear war when your adversary has a secure second strike capability? It's threatening a suicidal nuclear war, essentially, because you know if you attack, your adversary will respond with a devastating counterattack, and you'll be devastated. So how do you get around this credibility problem? Well, Schelling argued that there is a way around the credibility problem, and what you do is you make a, quote, threat that leaves something to chance. So you can't threaten to intentionally start a nuclear war, but you can engage in a crisis, like the Cuban Missile Crisis. You engage in a process where you make threats, mobilize military forces, put nuclear weapons on high alert, raise the risk of nuclear war in the hope that your adversary is less willing to run a risk of nuclear war than you are, and that your adversary will eventually back down and you'll get your way. So as long as each incremental increase in the risk of nuclear war is less than the potential gain of what is being fought over, say missiles in Cuba, then the threat to escalate these crises is credible in a way that threats to start a nuclear war is not. So then what determines the outcome of these crises, these games of nuclear chicken? Well, Schelling argued that before 1945, international political competition was, quote, a competition in military capabilities, but after 1945, it becomes a, quote, competition in risk-taking. The state that's willing to run the greatest risk of nuclear war will win, as long as the crisis doesn't end in nuclear war, which is possible. And so Schelling argued that, of course, countries don't eagerly bid up the risk of nuclear war in these crises. They badly want to avoid nuclear war. But at the same time, they don't want to lose this international political competition. So at each stage of the crisis, leaders face truly gut-wrenching decisions. Do we back down to avoid nuclear war, or do we escalate the crisis in hoping to win this international political contest? And so Schelling argued that it's the underlying stakes that determine who's willing to run the greater risk. So he said in the Cuban Missile Crisis, Cuba was an island just 90 miles off the coast of the United States, whereas for the Soviet Union, it was a distant island. It was about geopolitical influence on the other side of the world. So the United States cared more about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that's what allowed the United States to essentially prevail in the Cuban Missile Crisis. We were willing to run a greater risk because we had a greater stake. So I begin with nuclear brinkmanship theory. But what I do is then incorporate the nuclear balance of power. So Schelling and Thomas Powell and Jervis and Glaser and others have simply assumed that the nuclear balance of power doesn't matter because both sides have an assured second strike capability, because nuclear war would be devastating for all sides. But what I do is begin from there and then incorporate the nuclear balance in a more serious way. And so to do that, I draw on two assumptions well developed in the nuclear strategy literature. The first is that not all nuclear wars would be equally devastating. Nuclear strategists planning for nuclear war take into account things like numbers of deaths, numbers of years of economic recovery that would be required to come back after a nuclear war, levels of urban and industrial destruction, and how all these things would compare relative to an opponent. As Herman Kahn argued, quote, nuclear war scenarios in which a country suffers 10 million deaths versus 100 million deaths are tragic but distinguishable outcomes. As he similarly argued, quote, few people differentiate between having 10 million dead, 50 million dead, or 100 million dead. It all seems too horrible. However, it does not take much imagination to see that there is a difference, end quote. So first assumption that any nuclear war would be devastating, but some nuclear wars could be more devastating than others. Second, that nuclear superiority reduces the expected cost that a country would incur in the event of nuclear war. For two reasons. First, if an adversary has fewer warheads than you do, in a complete nuclear exchange, you would suffer fewer nuclear attacks than the adversary. But second, countries plan for counterforce targeting, using their nuclear weapons to destroy an opponent's nuclear weapons in order to blunt the amount of damage that the adversary could do to you in the event of nuclear war. So as Harold Brown, former Secretary of Defense, former director of this lab, actually once argued, quote, we have always considered it important in the event of war to be able to attack the forces that could do damage to the United States and its allies, end quote. So again, countries plan for counterforce targeting to reduce the damage, limit the damage they would suffer in the event of nuclear war. And countries with nuclear superiority can do better in those counterforce exchanges because they have more firepower with which to blunt their adversaries' capabilities. Okay. So applying these insights to brinkmanship theory, what should we expect? Well, on average, we should expect that in these nuclear crises, that nuclear superior states, because the risk of nuclear war is lower for them than for their adversary, should be willing to run a higher risk of nuclear war than their opponents. So again, if the cost of nuclear war is lower, holding everything else constant, you should be willing to run a higher risk of nuclear war in a crisis. Or in more colloquial terms, the logic is very simple. In a game of chicken, you might expect the smaller car to swerve first, even if a crash would be disastrous for both. And indeed, there's much illustrative evidence from historical crises that this is exactly how leaders think in these high-stakes nuclear crises. They pay close attention to the nuclear balance of power, and they believe that having nuclear superiority increases their bargaining leverage and encourages them to push harder in the crisis. So, for example, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, General Maxwell Taylor, chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, wrote in a memo to Secretary of Defense McNamara, quote, "We have the strategic advantage in our general war capabilities. This is no time to run scared." Similarly, Secretary of State Dean Rusk, in the XCOM in the meeting with President Kennedy, said, quote, "One thing Mr. Khrushchev may have in mind is that he knows that we have a substantial nuclear superiority. He also knows that we don't really live under fear of his nuclear weapons to the extent that he has to live under ours," end quote. And we see similar types of thinking in other crises in other regions around the world. So, for example, after the Kargil crisis in 1999 between India and Pakistan, India's defense minister, George Fernandez, was asked why he thought Pakistan ultimately backed down and withdrew its forces from across the line of control in Kashmir. And he argued that that Pakistan ultimately backed down because in the event of nuclear war, quote, "We may have lost part of our population, but Pakistan would have been completely wiped out," end quote. Okay. So in some deductive logic, and I don't bore you with it here, but in the paper that I published on this subject, have a game theoretic model that was first developed by Thomas Schelling laying out this deductive logic. So both deductive logic and illustrative evidence from historical cases suggest that nuclear superiority matters and gives states leverage in a crisis. Next slide, please. Oh, shoot. I meant to go to that a couple minutes ago, sorry. So from that I draw a couple of hypotheses. So first hypothesis, that we should expect that states that enjoy nuclear superiority with a nuclear advantage over their opponents will be more likely to win these nuclear crises, more likely to achieve their basic political goals in the crisis. And second, we should expect this to have a deterrent effect in the beginning. Why challenge a country to a nuclear crisis if you expect that that country is going to have a systematic advantage? So we should expect that on average, nuclear inferior states will be less likely to initiate conflict. So this gets us to hypothesis 2. States that enjoy nuclear superiority over an opponent will be less likely to become the target of a militarized challenge in the first place. Okay, so these are the hypotheses. The next thing I do is set out trying to test these hypotheses in a systematic fashion. So go ahead and jump 2 slides. All right, right there, that's good. So I do this in 2 studies. The first study was published earlier this year in International Organization, which is a top peer-reviewed international relations journal. And in this article, I focus on nuclear crisis outcomes. So what do I look at? Well, as Bruce was mentioning, this is quantitative political science. So for us, this is large N. I know that many of you are probably running simulations with millions of data points. I have 52 data points. So maybe not impressive to you all, but large N for political scientists. So I have 52 nuclear crisis dyads drawn from 20 separate nuclear crises. And so do a quantitative analysis, look at the outcomes of these crises, and then look at the nuclear balance of power, and then also control for other factors that might matter. Control for the conventional military balance of power, control for domestic political regime type, democracy, trade, other things that scholars of international relations have argued matter for crisis outcomes in other studies. And this isn't my own data set. I draw on a data set that is housed at the University of Maryland, this International Crisis Behavior Data Set. So they've put together a data set of every international crisis from 1815 to the present and code all kinds of information about all these crises. Who are the participants, who achieved their goals in the crisis, who didn't achieve their goals. And so what I do is go through this large data set and essentially identify the crises that involved nuclear-armed powers and pull those out. So doing that, I identify these 20 crises involving nuclear-armed powers, 52 nuclear crisis participants. So what do I find? Next slide, please. Well, first here is a list of the crises and the crisis participants. So you can see all your favorite nuclear crises are there. Cuban Missile Crisis, Berlin crises, crises between India and Pakistan, Sino-Soviet border war, et cetera. Next slide, please. Okay, so what do I find? Well, first let's start with the simple cross-tabulations. Looking at a simple crosstab between whether a country has nuclear superiority, which I measured simply as a warhead count. Does the country have more nuclear warheads than its opponents? I know it's a simplistic way of doing it, but it's a good proxy measure for, I think, what we're interested in. So do you have more warheads than your opponents? And do you achieve your basic goals in the crisis, yes or no? So first number I draw you to is the 35% at the bottom of the win column. So the first thing that you see is that often neither participant achieves its basic goals in the crisis. Often these crises end in stalemate or compromise. Only 35% of the cases does a country clearly achieve its basic goals in a nuclear crisis. A second number I draw your attention to, though, is 54%, just above that. So we see that countries with nuclear superiority tend to do much better than countries in a position of, or than the average participant that wins only 35% of the time. And they do much better than a country in a position of nuclear inferiority, which achieves its basic goals only 15% of the time in the observed cases. Next slide, please. So the next thing I did was a regression analysis where I control for the other variables that I mentioned before. So I won't bore you with tables, but just preview the findings. So first, I find that nuclear superiority matters. It's positive and statistically significantly correlated with achieving one's basic goals in a crisis. Countries with superiority, the substantive effect is they're about 3.5 times more likely to achieve their goals than a country in a position of inferiority, again controlling for other factors that might matter. And I found that not only the fact of superiority, but the degree of superiority mattered as well. Countries with a high level of nuclear superiority, which I defined as having 95% of the warheads in the dyad, were about 16 times more likely to win a crisis than a country with only 5% of the warheads in the dyad. And I also found support for the balance of stakes, the balance of resolve argument. I included control variables to get at how much a country might care about the crisis. And I did find that those variables were often statistically significant as well. But in addition, nuclear superiority also mattered. So the title of the published article was Nuclear Superiority and the Balance of Resolve, because I argue that this kind of historical debate is kind of missing the point, but on the other hand, they're both right. Nuclear superiority matters, but political stakes and the balance of resolve matters as well. Next slide, please. So this figure just illustrates the effect of the nuclear balance of power on nuclear crisis outcomes. So what we see on the x-axis is the level of nuclear superiority. It's simply a measure of the share of nuclear weapons that a state has within the dyad. So 0 means you don't have any weapons. 1 means you have all the weapons and your opponent has 0. 0.5 would be parity. And what you can see is that as your share of nuclear weapons within the dyad increases, the probability of victory also increases. Next slide, please. The next thing I did was to look and see how the changing nuclear balance of power mattered within a specific dyad over time. So what I do here is look at the US-Soviet nuclear balance of power during the Cold War, and also the outcomes of the crises between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. So the first thing that you can see is just how the nuclear balance of power between the United States and the Soviet Union changed over the Cold War, again using a warhead count. So you can see that at the beginning of the Cold War, the United States had a nuclear advantage. This advantage increased until the mid-1960s when the United States possessed roughly 25,000 more warheads than the Soviet Union, at which point the Soviet Union began cutting into US strategic superiority And by the 1970s or so, the Soviet Union overtook the United States in terms of aggregate warheads. The second thing you can see are the crises and the outcomes of those crises. So the crises are plotted on the line there. U.S. victories in blue triangles, U.S. non-victories in red circles. And what you can see is the United States tended to do much better in these crises when it had nuclear superiority. And the larger the margin of superiority, the better it seemed to do, winning 5 out of 6 crises when the United States had at least 10,000 more warheads than the Soviet Union. Next slide, please. So the second study I did focused on the first part of the question, the selection into crises in the first place. This is an article that's I've been invited to revise and resubmit to the Journal of Peace Research, another peer-reviewed international relations journal. But here I did a similar thing. I looked at observations of all states and all nuclear-armed states from 1945 to 2002. And here the dependent variable, instead of crisis outcome, is mid-initiation or military challenges. So one thing that international relations scholars do who are interested in war is focus on militarized interstate disputes, or MIDs. And the reason we do that is that there are few to wars for quantitative analysis, but we do have a lot of threats, shows of force, small-scale uses of force, and so we aggregate all of these up into militarized interstate disputes and focus on the causes of militarized interstate disputes. And we collect information on who's initiating these disputes and who is being targeted in these disputes. So what I focus on essentially here is who's being threatened militarily and who's not being threatened militarily. My key independent variable is these variables measuring the nuclear balance of power and nuclear superiority. And then I also control for these other variables that, again, international relations scholars have argued in the past are important determinants of these military challenges. So domestic political regime type, conventional military capabilities, alliances, geography, economic openness, and other variables. Okay, next slide. Okay, and what did I find in this study? Well, again, I found that, as I expected, that nuclear superiority provides an advantage. That countries with more warheads than their opponents are less likely to be targeted in these militarized disputes, and that the margin of superiority also seems to matter. The greater the margin of superiority, the less likely it was that a country would become the target of a military challenge. And then I also tried to test for the idea that just possessing nuclear weapons is enough and that the nuclear balance of power doesn't matter, or that a secure second strike capability is enough and that additional warheads beyond that are overkill and don't matter. And I didn't find support for those arguments. So what I found was that if you control or put in a variable for whether a country possesses nuclear weapons alone, that you did find that those countries are less likely to be challenged militarily. But once you also consider the nuclear balance of power, then those variables cease to be significant. So I think what that suggests is that if you're a nuclear-armed state against non-nuclear states, such as Israel against Arab adversaries in the Middle East, that nuclear weapons do provide a deterrent, but that if you're going up against other nuclear-armed states, that the nuclear balance of power does matter. So if you're China having a smaller arsenal than Russia or the United States, that does put you at a disadvantage. Okay, next slide, please. So again, here I just plot the substantive effect. Again, the nuclear ratio on the x-axis, the probability of being targeted in a military challenge on the y-axis. You can see here that the substantive effect is quite small. The likelihood that a country is targeted militarily by another country in any given year is small, that's why. But you can see the clear effect that as a country's share of nuclear weapons within the dyad increases, the probability that it's challenged militarily also decreases. Next slide, please. Okay, so with that, I'll start to wrap up. So what are the implications for international relations theory, for deterrence theory, for US defense policy? Well, I think the first clear implication is that people who have been arguing for the past half-century or so that nuclear superiority and the nuclear balance of power matters are correct. There's both strong theoretical reasons to believe that the nuclear balance of power would matter, and I think strong empirical evidence. So I don't think this is the last word, but it's certainly more systematic than research than anybody else has done on this question to date. So the implication for defense policy is that when sizing the nuclear arsenal, one of the things U.S. officials need to keep in mind is that the nuclear balance of power matters, and that the United States should strive for nuclear superiority, I would argue, as a goal of U.S. defense policy. So the goal of reductions for reduction's sake maybe isn't so wise, and that rather maintaining U.S. superiority over potential adversaries is something worthy of maintaining. Now, one question that always comes up is, well, maybe there are deterrent and coercive advantages to nuclear superiority, but aren't there also costs to maintaining nuclear superiority? Is it economically more costly? Does it cause nuclear proliferation in other countries? If we have a large nuclear arsenal, doesn't it make it more likely that Iran or North Korea acquire nuclear weapons? Or if we have a large nuclear arsenal, doesn't it make it harder to get international cooperation on nuclear nonproliferation issues in Iran, North Korea, or elsewhere? Or what about instability? Some people argue that if we have a large nuclear arsenal, that it makes nuclear war more likely, that it makes the Chinese and the Russians and other nuclear armed powers feel vulnerable. It puts them in a situation where they might feel the need to use them or lose them. They might feel that they could be vulnerable to a disarming first strike, so therefore in a crisis they'll be more likely to launch a preemptive nuclear attack. So those are all separate questions that deserve serious investigation. I've started to do some of this research on my own. I have an article in Foreign Policy magazine in September of October, so just the last issue, where I start to look at some of these questions. And my initial investigation suggests that a lot of these potential costs, I think, are overstated. I think it's hard to argue that our arsenal is somehow causing Iranian proliferation. I think Iran is making its decisions on its nuclear arsenal for a number of different, or on its nuclear program based on a lot of different considerations. But whether we have 1,500 or 1,000 nuclear weapons, I think, is not one of them. And similarly, when we think about trying to get international cooperation to put pressure on Iran, take Turkey as an example. Many people argue that countries like Turkey or Brazil will be unwilling to get tough on Iran as long as we maintain a large nuclear arsenal. But if we reduce, then these countries will be more likely to help us put pressure on Iran. But again, if you look at it from Brazil's point of view, from Turkey's point of view, there are a lot of things they're considering when they decide on what their non-proliferation policy toward Iran should be. Again, I think the size of our nuclear arsenal is not anywhere near the top of the list. If we cut from 1,550 to 1,000 nuclear weapons, it's kind of implausible to think that Turkey or Brazil are going to change their non-proliferation policy because of that. And similarly on economic cost and instability, I think some of these costs are often exaggerated, but we can talk more about that in Q&A. So in sum, what determines the outcome of nuclear crises? I think there's good theoretical and empirical reason to believe that the nuclear balance of power matters, and that we should take that seriously in thinking about U.S. defense policy. So, thank you.
Some questions here.
Hi there.
Oh, hold on, we got a mic.
Hi there. Is this on?
Yes.
Okay. One of the immediate questions I have is how you would separate superior nuclear capabilities from superior conventional capabilities. If you recreated your study with 52 data sets, 52 data points, and substituted superior conventional for superior nuclear, will you get the same results? Would that alone explain all of the outcomes?
Yeah, it's a good question. So as I mentioned briefly, I do control for the conventional balance of power as well. So one thing that international relations scholars do to measure conventional military power is we have this thing we call the SINC score, the Combined Capabilities Index. And so what this does is it's an index that takes 6 factors into account. So it looks at military expenditure, military personnel, total population, urban population, energy production, and iron and steel production, and aggregates these things up into an overall index. And it's imperfect, but it's what international relations scholars use to measure conventional military power. And then we look at the balance of conventional military power. And so it's done as a ratio. So essentially, in a dyad between 2 states, what share of conventional military power do you have relative to your adversary? Do you have all of it, none of it, somewhere in between? And so I include that variable in addition to these nuclear superiority variables. And so what's interesting in the regression analysis is that in the crisis outcomes paper, just the nuclear crisis outcome paper, conventional military power doesn't reach statistical significance, and the nuclear superiority variable does reach statistical significance, suggesting that the nuclear balance of power matters and conventional military power doesn't as much, which I think makes sense for a crisis among nuclear-armed states, that the nuclear balance of power would matter more than the conventional balance. What's interesting, though, is as I replicated the analysis, looking at all crises, not just nuclear crises, but crises with all both non-nuclear and nuclear states from 1945 to 2002. And there what I find is that both the conventional and the nuclear balance of power variables reach statistical significance. So I think that kind of makes intuitive sense that in crises involving states without nuclear weapons, that the conventional balance of power would matter much more. But in the crises looking only at the nuclear-armed states, it's really the nuclear balance, not the conventional balance, that seems to matter.
I wondered on the chart that showed U.S. superiority eroding in the 70s, there were 4 U.S. defeats. I just wondered, I should read the paper to figure out what they are, but what were those 4 defeats? And it's interesting that they occurred while we still had the edge. However, we are in decline. So is there sort of, have you taken into account sort of the vector, the direction of the stockpile in addition to the absolute numbers?
Yeah, it's a good question. So first thing I should point out is the dependent variable is does the state achieve its basic goals in the crisis or not? So not achieving goals doesn't necessarily mean you lost the crisis. It could be a stalemate or compromise. It just means you didn't clearly achieve your basic goals. So the 4 crises at the end, I could, off the top of my head, it was Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the Able Archer exercise in 1983, the Nicaragua MiG crisis where the Soviet Union, we thought, we're still not sure whether they were or not, but we thought they were trying to place MiG fighter aircraft in Nicaragua. I'm forgetting the 4th off the top of my head, but it's in the list. So those are the crises in which the United States didn't achieve its goals clearly in that period of decline. The change in direction is a good idea. I actually haven't looked at that, but maybe there is. Maybe it's about also the change in the nuclear balance of power and the trends rather than just the absolute balance. That's a good idea and something that I could look at in the future. So thank you.
So I was wondering if you've looked at any point at the stockpile composition vis-a-vis strategic versus tactical. I would especially expect some dependence on the tactical stockpile, especially in situations where the adversaries were next to each other. And then you also made a statement at the beginning concerning the technological superiority of the stockpile, and I was hoping you could expand on that.
So great question. So I mean, ideally, what I'd like to do is to be able to do what military planners do, thinking seriously about nuclear war for each case. So think about how would a nuclear war play out? What is the strategic balance? What are the accuracy of the delivery vehicles? What's the total megatonnage of the arsenal? What are the tactical weapons? But doing that for every crisis in every year would be quite a big challenge. Maybe something I could do in the future, but something that I didn't do for this study. So distinguishing between strategic and tactical would be a little bit easier. I should say the numbers on the data on numbers of nuclear weapons I took from the National Resources Defense Council website. They have estimates of the P5 nuclear arsenals from every year from 1945 to the present. And then for the other nuclear powers, I was able to pull the data together from other sources. So the NRDC has data broken down by strategic and tactical for the United States and Soviet Union, Russia, but not for the other powers. So I didn't think I was going to be able to get the strategic versus tactical for every other state, so I just focused on aggregate warhead levels. But this is a research agenda I would like to pursue in the future, and I think that is a direction I would very much like to go. And I'm considering doing a book on this subject, So if I do the book, nobody wants to read a bunch of statistical analysis, so I will focus much more on, maybe people in this room would. Outside of this room, I think there would be less interest. So there I would focus much more on the cases and get more into the fine-grained analysis of the nuclear balance of power. But it's something that I didn't do for this research.
So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on the effect of the persistent failure of the U.S. To recapitalize its nuclear weapons infrastructure on both the balance of resolve and our own perception of our nuclear superiority, and how that might affect future crises.
Well, it's something I'm concerned about. I think just spending the day here and talking to people around here, I think the life extension program, for example, of our different systems are very important, that we need to fund those life extension programs, and that if we allow the nuclear infrastructure to crumble, then this huge nuclear advantage that we've had over vis-a-vis most states over the past 50 years is at risk of wasting away. And I think that would be a real shame. I mean, I think there are a lot of people who, we've had this robust nuclear arsenal for so long, and it's underwritten everything I think we've done in international affairs, and it's been so effective that I think in doing what it was supposed to do, is deter major power war, deter nuclear war, that I think it almost goes unnoticed, and a lot of policymakers don't give it the credit it deserves, I think, because of that. So often when there are these budget trade-offs between funding the nuclear infrastructure, funding conventional capabilities that we might actually use, I think policymakers sometimes feel like they should fund the conventional capabilities that we might use. But as some people have argued, I think we use nuclear weapons every day. And so funding them and making sure that we maintain a robust nuclear arsenal, I think, is very important. So.
Michael.
Three terrific paper presentation. Three quick comments, and asking you to comment on comments. So the first is, isn't it true that at times it's not clear who, quote, won in a crisis? Take the most studied one, Cuban Missile Crisis. I don't think there was 1 out of 1,000 Americans who thinks that we lost that war. But on the Soviet side, they got a guarantee of no U.S. invasion of Cuba. They got a guarantee of no overthrow of Castro. They got us to take out some obsolescent missiles from Turkey. Not a bad deal. And all they had to do was put some missiles on some boats, send them to Cuba, and take them home. So I'm wondering, it strikes me that at times the clarity of the resolution of the crisis may not be so clear, or may be very subjective. You may think they won, and you may think they lost. That's one. So how do you code that? The second is, I'm a little concerned about I know it's the easiest thing to do, but counting warheads, I'm sure you discuss this in further, is the main mode of assuming or assessing nuclear superiority. I know from just my most recent DOD experience, the most senior guys with all the brass on their shoulders in secure places, they're really concerned about the capability of the retaliatory force to do damage after we strike. So if we struck an adversary first, what kind of capability could they have left over, and what kind of damage would they do to us? And is that acceptable damage to us, which often it's not. It's a more complex dynamic calculation, a lot based on retaliatory capabilities, and secure second strike capabilities of simple numerical calculations, which of course are easier to do. So any thoughts about that methodology? Can you just soup that up? And the third, which is really outside your study, but I am curious about the fact that nuclear weapon states fighting non-nuclear states, which you're not including here, we haven't done so well, right? I mean, we lost essentially in Vietnam. The Russians lost, Soviets lost in Afghanistan. The Israelis have had nuclear weapons for 40 years. They've been attacked many times. So nuclear deterrent against a non-nuclear state, you know, if it's carefully calibrated. Now that's really outside your subject, but and you'll take that. So those are three comments to Superiority.
Great. Thank you very much, Michael. And in full disclosure, Michael was on my dissertation committee at UC Berkeley when I did my PhD. Any flaws in the analysis are the result of poor guidance as a graduate student. So, thanks very much. Used to getting penetrating questions from him for the past decade or so. So first on who wins nuclear crises, how do you code these things, who won the Cuban Missile Crisis, did the Soviet Union actually win the Cuban Missile Crisis? You know, co-authoring an article with a friend of mine, and we were talking about this exact question, and he said, you know, saying the Soviet Union won the Cuban Missile Crisis is kind of like saying the 49ers won the Super Bowl last year, because even though they scored fewer points, their ticket sales increased the next year. And I think there's kind of something to that the crisis was clearly about the missiles in Cuba. That's what both sides really cared about, and on that issue, the United States clearly won. And yeah, some things went the Soviets' way as well, but the thing that the crisis was really about were the missiles, and on that one we scored more points. But I think the question is good more broadly is how do we code these things? And so what I did that insulates me from criticism a little bit is I took this off-the-shelf data set from the University of Maryland on crisis outcomes. And so they made a subjective decision about whether each country achieved its goals or not. And I think there are problems with some of the coding. Some of them are questionable. But at a minimum, I didn't code these in a way that would bias the results toward the hypothesis that I had. I took somebody else's data set and just did the analysis and found support. As I said, some of the coding I think is questionable. For example, the Berlin Wall crisis they claim is a victory for the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union built this big wall in the middle of Berlin and we didn't do anything about it. But many historians would argue that the West really won that crisis because really what the crisis was about was turning over access to West Berlin to the East Berlin government, and that Khrushchev didn't do that even though he had threatened to. So So the broader point here is on a lot of these questionable ones, if you recode them, they actually would favor my hypothesis. They wouldn't work against me. So if we coded Berlin as a victory for the West, not for the Soviet Union, that's a period when the United States had clear superiority. That would be another case of a superior state winning. And many of the other coding calls that I disagree with would actually work in my favor, not against me. Second is measuring numbers of nuclear warheads, sufficient or not. How do we think about it in a more sophisticated way? So I think that you're absolutely right. I mean, at the end of the day, what I care about is how much damage would each state suffer in the event of nuclear war. And it's the things that would reduce your expected damage in the event of nuclear war that would embolden you to push a little bit harder in a crisis. So anything that would reduce the damage your homeland would suffer in the event of nuclear war should contribute to your resolve in a crisis. So missile defenses could do that. Having a large territory with a dispersed population could do that. Having civil defenses, fallout shelters could do that. And having a nuclear counterforce capability and nuclear superiority is just one of the things that would contribute to that calculation. And then within that category of nuclear superiority counterforce, what matters is, exactly as you point out, how much of the adversary's force could you destroy? How much would be left over that would then do damage to your homeland? So that is really what I care about. Ideally, what I'd be measuring is precisely that. But measuring it carefully for every state, every pair of states actually, and every year from 1945 to the present would be quite difficult. So I use the warhead count. So it's not perfect, but I think it's actually a reasonable proxy measure of what I'm interested in. In general, countries with more warheads do have more of an ability to do this kind of counterforce targeting that would limit damage to them in a crisis. So it's not a perfect measure of what I'm interested in, but I think it's strongly correlated with what I'm interested in. The third question, what about nuclear, non-nuclear? And don't nuclear weapon states get beat up all the time by non-nuclear weapon states? So I think, this is social science, not physics, obviously. The social world is more complicated. None of these findings hold perfectly. So the question is really, these are probabilistic, not deterministic type arguments. So the question is, on average, do nuclear armed states do better than non-nuclear states? On average, do nuclear superior states do better than nuclear inferior states? And I find that the answer to both of those questions is yes. So there are outliers. There are high-profile examples of nuclear states failing to get their way against non-nuclear states. But one of the things that I do that I didn't talk about is well, I think I might have mentioned it in response to another question. I do the analysis looking at all states, nuclear and non-nuclear. And there find that nuclear weapon states, on average, are more likely to get their way than non-nuclear states. And that's essentially also replicating a study that had already been done. A couple of colleagues of mine, Kyle Beardsley at Duke and Victor Asal at SUNY Albany, did an article in the Journal of Conflict Resolution in 2009, looking specifically at this question: are nuclear states more likely than non-nuclear states to win crises? And they find that yes, controlling for other things, nuclear states are more likely to win crises. And so what I do here is really kind of building on their analysis, and instead of just looking at nuclear, non-nuclear, looking at the nuclear balance of power and find something different, that nuclear superiority seems to matter. So in short, might not be totally satisfying, but my findings suggest that those are outliers, important outliers, but outliers.
I can just slip in one thing, though. What was a little disturbing is that, putting aside the implications for the U.S., which might be, okay, we need nuclear superiority, this is a highly, this result, if widely read, is highly stimulative to nuclear proliferation, because it means every nuclear aspirant would say, boy, Mr. Kroenig, we'd rather have nuclear superiority over our regional adversaries, or we can make this around. So that's not something that the nation would want to have as a policy prescription.
So my study should be classified.
I think it should be shredded.
But on that point, so I mean, I think one implication of this is that arms racing, in certain circumstances anyway, can be rational. You know, I think some people looked at what happened during the Cold War and said, oh, it was just a period of collective insanity. You know, what were we doing? Robert Jervis, a famous professor at Columbia, wrote a book called The Illogic of American Nuclear Strategy, where he argued that we were striving for superiority over the Soviet Union, and it didn't matter, because once we had a secure second strike capability, that was all that mattered, so it was illogical. And so I think what these findings suggest is that actually it does make sense for countries to seek a nuclear advantage over their adversary. And so I think many countries around the world don't need to read my study to think that. Pakistan today, for example, seems to be arms racing against India, looking for a nuclear advantage over India. Other countries like China, the more puzzling question is, why haven't they built a larger arsenal? Why have they been content with a small arsenal for so long? And that's a good question. Traditionally, people argued that it was because of Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping's strategic thought, that they had this idea that a secure second strike capability was enough and they didn't need any more. There's been some recent research, though, that suggests that it was also in part a result of kind of organizational and political pathologies in Beijing that made it difficult for them to build a larger arsenal, but that those kinks might be out of the system, and China, well, many countries around the world actually are moving in the other direction. So in the United States and in the West, while we reduce arsenals, Russia is building new delivery vehicles, China is modernizing and expanding its arsenal, India, Pakistan, all expanding and modernizing their arsenals. So I think that there are plenty of strategic thinkers around the world who don't need to read this study to know that nuclear weapons can provide their country with advantages.
I had a question. So this is the second time I've heard at least part of your presentation, and I really enjoyed it even the second time around. But I had a question for you with regards to the logic of crisis initiation. Right? So if your hypothesis holds, which is that nuclear superiority matters, and presumably all states have some sort of intelligence gathering capabilities so that they know, the numbers of nuclear weapons that their adversaries have. And we also know that, well, presumably that, states don't view crisis entrance as simply costless, right? There are domestic audience costs to losing crises, there are international reputational costs to losing crises, so they don't just sort of blindly throw themselves into crises. So if they are, calculated risk takers, and they know presumably what their adversarial, or what their adversaries have in terms of the numbers of nuclear weapons, what explains their decision to enter into a crisis if they already know that they're being outnumbered, right? Because presumably it's better to simply withdraw or concede whatever is being contested than to enter into a crisis that you are likely to lose because you are you have an inferior number of nuclear weapons.
Yeah, no, so you're exactly right that if nuclear superiority provided kind of the ultimate trump card and the world were perfectly rational, then we should never expect to see crises at all. That nuclear superior states would simply get their way, nuclear inferior states would never challenge them. But there's still, but I think those things aren't true, that nuclear superiority isn't the ultimate trump card. It's one thing among a number of other factors that I also find matter, including the balance of stakes and looking at the broader data set, including non-nuclear states, conventional power. So there are a number of things that matter, not just nuclear weapons. But then also, there can be uncertainty about a lot of these variables as well. And so there, from a rational point of view, you can still get into a crisis if there's just uncertainty about the balance of resolve. So you might know that your adversary's nuclear superiority gives him an advantage there, that will increase his level of resolve, but you still don't know ultimately what level of risk of nuclear war he's willing to run. You're maybe not even sure that you know what level of risk of nuclear war that you're willing to run. So it's that uncertainty about the balance of resolve. What risk of nuclear war am I willing to run? What risk of nuclear war is he willing to run? Where's that balance that allows these crises to happen in the first place? So I think that leaders know full well that being in a nuclear inferior position disadvantages them, but they still might think for whatever reasons that the balance of resolve would be in their favor. Then methodologically, though, one of the things I do is look at selection into crises and do kind of two-stage modeling of what determines whether countries get into crises, and then once you're in the crisis, what determines who wins. And doing 3 different tests for selection into crises, I still find this result that nuclear superior states are more likely to win. So.
2 questions. One, I think touches on something you said in the beginning, which is, you're arguing that the balance of power, meaning the relative numbers of warheads, matters in these crises. If you go back and look at these crises, to what extent was that relative balance known to the parties? And the second question is, since you're on this basis advocating for, the strive for superiority, how many policymakers in Washington believe that the role of U.S. nuclear weapons are so that we can win out in non-nuclear crises as opposed to deterring nuclear attack?
So great question. So first, to what degree was the balance of power known? I think that it's unlikely that leaders knew an exact warhead count of their adversary. But really what matters is whether you have the advantage or not. And I think that leaders have enough information about their own arsenal size and adversaries' arsenal size to have a sense of who has an advantage and what the rough size of that advantage is. And so sometimes when I give this talk, people will say, well, what about the missile gap and what about the bomber gap in the early Cold War days? But as people in this room probably know, those debates were really more about trends in the development of the Soviet arsenal, and would the Soviet arsenal increase at a rate to where we'd be in an inferior position. So our analysis of the actual nuclear balance of power was always pretty good. The fears of a gap, which later turned out to be incorrect, were more projections about what the future gap might be. So in short, I think leaders have a pretty good estimate of what the nuclear balance of power is. In terms of what is the role of U.S. nuclear weapons, it's a great question. I think it's something that people, experts disagree on. It's something that administrations disagree on. So there are many people who would argue that the only goal of U.S. nuclear weapons should be to deter nuclear attack from other states. But even if that is the case, I think that this is evidence of nuclear weapons playing a role in deterring a nuclear attack. Because there are a lot of different ways that nuclear attack could occur. So one way is that a leader somewhere wakes up one day and says, today's a good day for nuclear war, and decides to press the button. And so that's one way it could play out. I think the much more likely way that it would play out is that states get into some kind of crisis, some kind of non-nuclear crisis over something, like missiles in Cuba, like Berlin, like Kashmir between India and Pakistan, and that the 2 sides escalate the crisis, as the crisis escalates, that nuclear weapons are used inadvertently, accidentally, or things just kind of spiral out of control. And so I think what I'm showing here is that having a nuclear advantage makes it much more likely that your adversary backs down backs down earlier in the crisis and makes it less likely that you get to that point anyway. So even if you think that the role of nuclear weapons is only to deter nuclear war, I think this is evidence that nuclear superiority does deter nuclear war from crisis escalation.
Matt, first of all, I want to thank you for having the courage to come to unpopular conclusions. Unlike Michael, I'm not so worried about what our adversaries might think of your work. I'm more worried about what your university colleagues might think and your chances of becoming a full professor. Anyway, but along one of the things that I would be interested in as you refine your research here is to look at how do we distinguish between let's say the October War and the Cuban Missile Crisis on the one hand, and then the Nicaraguan MiG-25 on the other hand. Those are hugely different cases where the stakes are so different, and I would venture to think that certainly on our part, we didn't even think of that as a nuclear crisis. So if you could have some kind of gradation of crises, I think that would be interesting. The second one is to, like you said, I would reopen the whole question of the University of Maryland's perception of who won crises. I mean, like for instance, Able Archer, they think that the Soviet Union won that one. I certainly don't think the Soviet Union thought they won that one. I mean, obviously we kind of backed down a little bit because of the Gordievsky knowledge that we had, but I think it scared the living daylights out of them. Likewise, on the Afghanistan one, as you recall, one of the things that we as a country, the West was concerned about was the extent to which that was a move, that was a prelude into the Persian Gulf, and then to what extent is still, I don't know whether there's been something declassified on this, but big debates as to whether we threaten to use nuclear weapons to prevent them from marching to the Persian Gulf. And I don't know where that all stands in terms of what the literature says, but I think that would be interesting to hear. And then finally, again, to just amplify a theme about not just using sheer numbers of warheads. And you recall the debates in foreign policy and national security in the early 2000s that talked about how the overwhelming superiority of the United States in strategic nuclear, and particularly counterforce capabilities, was hugely destabilizing. Yet on your graph, you had the Soviet Union being superior to us during that time frame.
Yeah, that's a good question. So first, I'm happy to report that I was recently promoted to associate professor with tenure. So that means, yeah. So I think in my contract now, unless I keep my job unless I engage in moral turpitude. So I just maybe for some, but I think to be more fair to my colleagues, though, I think really what a lot of them care about most is really the good social scientific methods. So I think as long as I'm asking clear questions, developing hypotheses, testing them in rigorous ways, most of my colleagues are not really concerned about what conclusions I come from and what the implications are. A lot of them aren't even aware of what the implications are because they're more social scientists just focused on the literature. And so I think that they were happy that this was published in the top journal. So you raise a good point about kind of level of hostility, and it's a question I get all the time. Isn't the Cuban Missile Crisis different from some of these other crises? After all, the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy said there was up to a 50% chance that it would have ended in nuclear war. These other ones, it didn't seem like the whiff of split atoms was even in the air. So how do I include these together? So my response to that, though, is that theoretically, as I was kind of saying in response to Joe's question, is if nuclear weapons do have this kind of powerful coercive effect, what we should often expect is that the nuclear inferior state is going to look down the game tree and say, how is this going to play out? And so they get into a crisis and they say, well, do I escalate this crisis or not? I know that if I escalate, the other guy has this systematic advantage. Maybe it's better to just back down now. So I think if you focus only on the ones that escalate to a very high level, that's actually biasing the sample against my hypothesis. My hypothesis would suggest that a lot of the crises would never even get to that level because the inferior state is going to back down. But I think just by focusing on crises in and of itself, I'm already focusing on higher level events. So I'm only looking at the 20 most serious crises between nuclear armed states from 1945 to 2002. These are events that this ICB data set have coded as crises, which they define as a serious threat of military escalation. At least one side believes its core values are threatened. Can't remember the third condition, but anyway, it's a fairly serious subset of cases. And my hunch is that if you go through and look at the most serious crises, that my hypothesis seems to do even better. If you just think about the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Cargill Crisis, the Sino-Soviet border war, the cases that come to people's minds, in almost all of those cases, it was the superior state that got its way. It's a good question, but in short, I think that my findings hold, even if no matter how we think about defining the level of hostility to determine whether something qualifies as a crisis or not. On the coding of cases, it's good. Able Archer, I'm not sure off the top of my head how ICB codes it. They certainly don't code it as a U.S. victory, but I'm not sure that they code it as a Soviet victory or U.S. defeat. It might be a stalemate or a compromise. The war in Afghanistan, people often say, well, isn't this really a case of U.S. victory and Soviet defeat? After all, it eventually led to the Soviet Empire kind of bleeding itself dry and the end of the Cold War. But at the time, in the actual kind of crisis mode when they first invaded, there was a lot of concern in Washington that this was, what should we do about this? We can't let this stand. But in the end, we weren't willing to risk nuclear war to roll back the Soviet invasion. So that's kind of how the ICB codes it in that initial crisis period, and I think that makes sense. Who had the advantage at the end of the Cold War? Yeah, the Soviet Union had more nuclear weapons, but didn't we really have a qualitative advantage? It's a good question. So one of the things that I think it's really only the United States that you could argue might have superiority, even if it has fewer warheads because of our technological edge. So one of the things that I do is remove the United States from the data sets and rerun the analysis, and I see that the findings still hold. So that gives me some confidence that by just measuring the quantitative nuclear balance, I'm not biasing the findings in some way.
Tristan?
Hi, Matt. So it's been good following this project for the last couple of years. So upon my third year now of seeing you present this, I'm very happy that you're here at the lab in CGSR. So the question I have this time, I know we've had a number of spirited discussions in DC about this, is what's the take home for a military strategist in emerging new nuclear weapons today? They see your work and they say, okay, for material, technological, or bureaucratic reasons, we simply can't hope to compete in terms of numbers, or sophistication for that matter. So is there a shortcut that we can take in terms of how we deploy the few nuclear weapons that we do have that can allow us to win in crises? I'm thinking in terms of, is there something that we can do that makes it riskier for a superior state to engage with us, that increases the likelihood that we're actually going to use nuclear weapons at a lower force level? So I'm wondering, for your book project, as you turn towards that, are you going to start looking at this evolution of nuclear force postures, especially for emerging and new nuclear weapon states like North Korea today and Pakistan 10 years ago, and certainly today as well?
Well, first thing I would say is that if my argument's right, then the take-home message to any country is that the things that provide leverage in a crisis are the ability to do damage to your adversary and the ability to limit damage to yourself in the event of nuclear war. So anything that would contribute to those goals should increase your resolve in a crisis. So if you can't have a nuclear counterforce advantage, there might be other things you can do to protect your population or to do damage to your adversary, short of having a counterforce capability. It seems that you suggest, though, that the takeaway message might be that we should escalate early in a crisis if we're in a position of inferiority. And that's the argument that's often traditionally been made about why, one of the reasons why nuclear superiority might be dangerous, that you put your adversary in a use it or lose it type situation, so they might have an incentive to go first. And I think that, but theoretically there's a strong argument in the other direction. Theoretically, so on one hand, maybe the country with few nuclear weapons uses them in order not to lose them. On the other hand, you might think, well, wait a second. If this leader has a choice between starting a nuclear war, he will lose for sure because he's in a position of inferiority. Inferiority is so severe that he might be vulnerable to a disarming first strike. and he has a choice of starting this nuclear war intentionally that he's certainly going to lose, or simply backing down, seems like it's much more likely that the leader would simply back down. And I think that then empirically what my study suggests is more evidence for the latter than for the former. We've seen many, many times leaders in inferior positions backing down in these crises. We've never seen a leader in one of these crises start a nuclear war intentionally because he was afraid he was going to lose them. So I would say that that's probably not one of the implications of my study, but there might be other interesting implications, and I'd be interested in exploring those with you. So,
Hey, Matt.
yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.